There is something about the end of November that changes people. The air gets colder, the days get shorter. The light fades a little earlier each evening, and somewhere deep inside the human heart, a switch gets flipped. A switch that says, get what you can before winter closes in. It's primal, really, some ancient buried instinct that never quite went away, no matter how many thousands of years we spent building cities and passing laws and telling ourselves we were civilized. And then Black Friday rolls around, and the thin, polished surface of that civilization cracks open like a storefront window, and out pours everything we pretend we're not. Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about the people you pass every day. The neighbor who waves from her driveway. The man at the gas station who holds the door open without being asked. The woman at the pharmacy counter with the kind eyes and the sensible shoes. Decent people, every one of them. The kind of people who would help you if your car broke down or bring soup to your door when you're sick. And yet, put the right sale tag on the right television set, drop the right discount on the right toy shelf, and some of those same people will elbow a grandmother out of the way, shatter a blender over someone's head, and think absolutely nothing of it when they're wheeling their bargain to the checkout. That's what Black Friday does to us. That's what it reveals. But the stories I have for you tonight aren't only about the chaos of a sale. They're about what happens in the quiet corners, in the dimly lit storage rooms, in the late-night grocery aisles, in the break of a moment when you think no one is watching. They're about the strange things that crawl out of the dark when human beings are pushed or tempted or left unsupervised. They are funny, some of them, deeply unsettling, others. And one of them I carry with me still, like a bruise that never quite heals. Some of these stories were sent in by people who just needed someone to hear what happened to them. People who clocked into an ordinary shift and walked out the other side forever changed. Retail workers, security guards, pharmacists, gas station managers. People who spend their working lives on the front lines of ordinary human behavior, watching it buckle and bend under pressure. And people who were just out there living their lives shopping for lingerie or late-night groceries, who encountered something they still can't fully explain. If you're new here, welcome. This is the kind of place where we sit down together and we don't look away. We talk about the dark things and the strange things and the things that don't add up, and we hold space for all of it. So go ahead and settle in, find yourself a comfortable spot, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Hit that bell while you're at it, because tonight we have a lot of ground to cover, and you are going to want to stay until the very end. Let's begin. Story 1, The Midnight Snacker. So this story takes place at a 7-Eleven during what turned out to be one of the strangest and most exhausting Black Fridays the narrator had ever worked. Now, to be clear, 7-Eleven doesn't typically run Black Friday promotions. Not really. The year before, there had been that famous Bring Your Own Cup deal, and it had apparently seared itself into the collective memory of the local customer base. Because even this year, when no such offer existed, people showed up clutching cups of every conceivable size, ready for infinite refills that were simply not going to happen. And so along with everything else that evening, a significant portion of the shift involved gently explaining to disappointed customers that no, this year the store was not participating in that particular promotion. There were some modest discounts on certain items, nothing earth-shattering, nothing worth camping out for, certainly. But you wouldn't have known it from the sheer volume of people who poured through that door. The store was absolutely packed for most of the night, humming and buzzing like something alive. And the narrator, who had made the reasonable assumption that a 7-Eleven on Black Friday couldn't possibly be as taxing as, say, a Best Buy or a Target, found themselves very quickly corrected on that point. And having worked retail at both a Target and a Best Buy on Black Friday in previous years, the narrator knew full well what the real deep end of that particular pool looked like. There is a specific kind of madness that descends on large electronics and department stores during those sales. A crushing, relentless, nearly violent scramble for discounted goods. And the narrator had once witnessed a 60-inch television fall from a display shelf and land directly on a customer's head. A real event, a real person, a real television. And that image had stayed with them. But tonight was different. Tonight was a convenience store, and it was only the narrator, their coworker Bugs, and a woman named January, a coworker the narrator had developed something of a quiet crush on, managing the floor. 3 people for what turned out to be an unexpectedly relentless stream of customers. No breaks, no breathing room, just a constant, non-stop wave of people wanting things. It wasn't until around 4 in the morning that the store finally settled into its natural late-night state, nearly empty, peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels almost sacred after hours of noise, and the narrator allowed themselves a long exhale, the kind you don't realize you've been holding all night. It was in this moment of relative calm that January went to the back storage room to restock the Cheeto shelf. A routine task, a completely ordinary errand. Except that nothing about what she found back there was ordinary at all. Because somewhere during the chaos of that long, busy night, in the rush and the noise and the relentless foot traffic, the narrator had made one critical error. While carrying out some of the cardboard recycling earlier in the shift, they had failed to lock the back door behind them. A simple oversight, an understandable one given the circumstances, but an oversight with consequences. A man, a large man by all accounts who appeared to be without stable housing, had slipped in through that unlocked back door sometime during the busiest part of the night. And he had made himself very comfortable in the small storage room at the back of the store. He had not been interested in the perishables. He had not reached for anything refrigerated or nutritious. What he had been interested in was a truly staggering quantity of junk food, Twinkies, beef jerky, Takis, things that crinkled and crunched and left artificial coloring on your fingers. Warm cans of Red Bull and Monster Energy, necked one after another. By the time January stumbled across him, the lower half of his face was stained blue from the powdered coating of whatever he'd been eating most recently, and the storage room floor was littered with empty wrappers and crumpled cans. He was a big man, well over 300 pounds by the look of him. At some point during his private feast, the warmth of the room and the exertion of eating had apparently become too much, because he had stripped off his winter coat and his sweater and was sitting in the corner in nothing but shorts and a dirty white undershirt. Beside him, arranged with a certain domestic tidiness that was almost touching, was a folded sleeping bag. He had not just snuck in to eat, he had planned to spend the night. The narrator rushed back upon January's urgent call and found themselves standing in the doorway of their own storage room, looking at this man who was slowly looking back up at them, mouth still working through whatever he'd last been chewing. "Hey, buddy," the narrator said, because in that moment it seemed like the most reasonable thing to say. "You know you've got to pay for that." The man blinked, and in that pause, in that small, still moment, the narrator watched something dawn slowly across the man's face. The gradual, almost painful realization that the items he had been consuming were not, in fact, complimentary, that someone was going to expect payment, that there was going to be an accounting. Now, the narrator did feel a flicker of genuine sympathy, the sleeping bag, the stripped layers, the particular desperation of a man who had eaten himself into a stupor on gas station snacks in the back room of a convenience store at 4 a.m. on a holiday weekend. Whatever the circumstances that had brought him there, they were not circumstances anyone would choose. But sympathy has its limits when you're staring at the remains of what amounts to several $100s of inventory consumed without permission. And then the man stood up. Chalk dust drifted from his clothes like a small, slow snowfall. He pointed a large finger directly at the narrator and said, with the full energy of someone who had been deeply wronged, "And how the hell do you expect me to explain this to my wife?" The narrator's sympathy took a slight step backward. There was a brief, surreal negotiation that followed. The narrator suggested, as diplomatically as possible, that payment for the consumed items would be the most straightforward solution. The man rejected this. He countered with several alternatives. The first was that they simply declare him the winner of a Black Friday sweepstakes, one that did not exist. The second was that the narrator personally cover half the bill and the man would manage the rest. And the third offer, the one that crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, was that he would settle the debt in full, provided that January performed a striptease for him first. The narrator did not respond diplomatically to that one. January was instructed to call the police. Their coworker Bugs was alerted to the situation. Now the narrator had expected an argument, a standoff, the kind of tense waiting game that stretches out until the authorities arrive. What they did not expect was for a man of that size to launch himself across the storage room with the speed and force of something considerably more aerodynamic than he appeared. It happened fast, a wall of bulk moving through the air, and the next thing the narrator knew, they were tumbling backward into a carefully stacked pallet of store-brand toilet paper. The man burst out of the storage room, heading at full speed for the back door, the same door he'd used to enter. What he didn't know was that Bugs had locked it. The sound of the impact was, by all accounts, considerable. Bugs, whose nickname conveyed none of his actual physical presence, because the man was enormous, muscular, and apparently built for exactly this kind of situation, had secured the door and was positioned just behind it. The fleeing man hit the locked door at full speed and was immediately redirected by what can only be described as a professional-grade takedown, delivered by a coworker who apparently spent his off hours doing something that had prepared him extremely well for moments like this one. He was pinned to the ground and held there, calm as anything, until the police arrived. In the aftermath, The 3 staff members received a brief lecture from an area manager about mindfulness and the importance of secured entries. Since no camera footage existed to definitively identify who had left the back door open, they agreed as a team not to answer that particular question out loud. The intruder, it turned out, was not unhoused. He had a wife, he had children, he had a house. He had, according to what came out later, been struggling significantly with stress and insomnia, and had been prescribed a sleep medication that had been affecting his behavior in ways that were difficult to predict. Charges were reduced. A fine was issued. A suspended sentence was handed down. The narrator wasn't entirely unsympathetic even after all of it. Life can press people into strange corners. The sleeping bag, the junk food, the dark storage room. There was something profoundly sad about all of it, really. But the narrator also suspected, just a little, that the man had simply wanted the Takis. If this is your first time here, welcome to the channel. We'd love to have you stay. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We put out new videos regularly, and there is always something waiting for you. Story 2. The Early Shopper. The narrator of this story did not work Black Friday. That was, for many years, a firm personal policy, an absolute, non-negotiable refusal grounded in hard experience and an honest self-assessment of their own tolerance for demanding crowds. What they did agree to, each year, as a compromise with the management they worked for, was to come in the night before and help with the setup, the preparation shift, the quiet, pleasant, satisfying work of transforming the store into something special before the doors opened and the madness began. And back before sales became so routine that they lost all meaning, back when a genuine discount was still a genuine event, Black Friday setup had a certain warmth to it. There was something almost festive about arranging the displays and stacking the stock and making everything look inviting and organized. The January sales used to be like this too, the narrator remembered. A single day or a single period when you could actually find savings that weren't available any other time of year, when a sale meant something. This was that, but in November. The store sold electronics and appliances and all the kinds of things that families saved up for and debated over before committing. And so there were display pyramids of boxed VHS players to construct, and stereo system components to arrange, and kitchen appliances to position at just the right angle. 3 staff members, a quiet store, soft lighting, and no customers. It was genuinely one of the narrator's favorite shifts of the year. They were working on the VHS display when they first heard it. The sound came from the kitchen appliance section, a soft mechanical creak, the kind made by a refrigerator door being opened and then gently closed. An unremarkable sound in almost any context, but in a closed store in the middle of the night, with all 3 staff members visible to each other, and none of them anywhere near the kitchen section, it landed differently. It settled in the chest in a way that was harder to explain than to feel. The narrator chose, in a display of what they would later call infinite bravery, to ignore it and move on to the next display. A few minutes later, one of the other staff members approached with a troubled look and asked whether anyone else had been scheduled that night, because they were fairly certain they'd seen a 4th person, a figure they didn't recognize, dressed like a regular customer rather than a staff member, lingering near the camcorder and camera display. The 3 of them went to investigate. There was no one there, but one of the display cameras was very slightly out of position, tilted at an angle that didn't match how it had been set up, as if someone had handled it, as if someone had picked it up, looked through it, and then set it back down without being quite careful enough. The narrator checked the footage. What they found was a few seconds of film, short, abrupt, the kind of clip that feels more like evidence than entertainment. A man looking directly into the lens. Heavy glasses, the thick kind that people used to call bottle glass lenses. A full, dense mustache. An expression of complete surprise, as though the camera had caught him rather than the other way around. And then the footage ended. The display model's clock was incorrectly set, so there was no way to determine exactly when the recording had been made. It could have been moments ago. It could have been earlier in the evening. The answer arrived on its own. While the 3 of them stood there discussing what they'd seen, the door to the back storage room crept open in front of them, slow and deliberate and impossible to misread, and then swung shut with a bang. None of them had been near it. None of them had touched it. They ran to the storage room door. They locked it from the outside. And then they looked through the small window in the upper half of the door. The man from the camera footage was sitting in the corner of the storage room. He was wearing pajamas. A sleeping bag was spread out on the floor beside him. He looked, in the beam of their flashlight, like someone who had been planning a very comfortable night. The police were called immediately. What emerged as the situation was untangled was almost understandable in its original logic. The man had hidden in the store at closing time, intentionally avoiding being swept out with the last customers, with the specific plan of being inside the store when it opened for Black Friday the following morning. No waiting in line, no competing with crowds. He would simply be there already, ahead of everyone, with first access to everything on the shelves. In some narrow, strange way, the narrator later said, there was something almost wholesome about the idea. He'd wanted his Black Friday deals badly enough to spend the night on a storage room floor in his pajamas. But then the police searched through the man's belongings. Among them, they found a camcorder, one of the display models taken from the shelf, something the narrator hadn't noticed was missing in the chaos of discovering the intruder. And the footage on that camcorder was not of the store's inventory, nor of the man's own face peering curiously into a lens. What was on that camera was deeply, horribly disturbing. Filmed within the previous few hours of that same night, it contained footage of the narrator and their female colleague, both of them, captured without consent and without their knowledge, in the most vulnerable and private moments possible. The man had spent part of his long night hidden in the store's bathroom, waiting, with a camcorder he had taught himself to operate, filming whatever he could capture from beneath the stall dividers. Every charge available was pressed. The legal process was thorough and, for the narrator, deeply uncomfortable, particularly the moment in court when the footage was reviewed. But it was worth it, the narrator said, to ensure that this man faced real and significant consequences. He served a meaningful sentence. The narrator hoped, years later, that they would never have to encounter him again. And given everything, they admitted that they didn't feel terribly guilty about hoping that the years since had not been kind to him. Some people, after all, use the dark for things the rest of us can never forgive. Story 3. The Rash. This one was shared by a pharmacist with more than 3 decades of experience at a Walgreens, someone who had, in that time, seen a very wide range of human behavior from behind the counter. And this, they said, remained one of the most disturbing. Not for what happened to them personally, but for what happened to a young colleague named Jaime. Jaime was 19 years old at the time of this story. She was working the pharmacy checkout as a temporary job while studying biology at college. A bright, conscientious young woman who was new to the role and still learning the boundaries of what fell within her professional responsibilities. The pharmacist narrator knew her as someone who worked hard, took her job seriously, and genuinely tried to be helpful to every customer who came to her window. One afternoon, a middle-aged man came to Jaime's counter. The narrator had seen him before, had watched him collect prescriptions over several visits, usually accompanied by his wife. He was apparently a family man, a regular, someone unremarkable enough that he had never registered as a concern. This visit, he was alone. He told Jaime that he had developed a rash on his upper thigh. It was uncomfortable, he said. It was bothering him. Rather than having to show his actual leg, he had taken some photographs on his phone that would make the consultation easier and less embarrassing for everyone. He produced the phone and showed Jaime the image. Jaime should, by the established protocol, have redirected him to the pharmacist, but being new, being young, being eager to be useful, she agreed to take a look. She studied the photograph and, doing her best with the training she had, concluded that the rash appeared to be the result of an allergic reaction. She recommended an antihistamine cream and sent him on his way. He returned about a week later. The cream had helped at first, he said, but it had stopped working. He had a new photo to show the current condition. This was plausible enough. A person occasionally needs a stronger formulation than the first recommendation. Jaime had mentioned that possibility herself. She looked at the new photograph. This time, the angle was slightly different. It showed more than just a rash on a thigh. In the corner of the image, partially visible and clearly unintentional, or so it seemed, was a small part of the man's anatomy that Jaime had not expected to see. She was a young woman. She was 19. She flushed deeply but said nothing and kept her expression as professional as she could manage. She recommended a stronger version of the cream. The man thanked her and left without seeming to notice her discomfort. A few weeks passed. He returned. The narrator, who was on shift that day, happened to notice him as he approached Jaime's counter. Something nagged. A sense that this man always seemed to time his visits to the hours when Jaime was working, even though she worked limited part-time hours. It was the kind of thing that registered in the back of the mind without quite assembling itself into a conclusion. He showed Jaime a third photograph. This one left very little to the imagination. What was supposedly a rash photo now contained a significant and unmistakable portion of the man's private anatomy. Jaime did not react outwardly. She kept her composure. She was a professional even at 19, even in a situation she had no framework for navigating. She made her recommendation. Then the man asked if she was okay, and then he smiled and made a comment, a joke, he seemed to think, suggesting that his bare thigh must be having an effect on her. The narrator overheard that. After the man left, they pulled Jaime aside. She was reluctant to explain at first, but eventually she told them everything. About the 3 visits, the photographs, the way each one had shown progressively more than the last. She was troubled and embarrassed and wasn't entirely sure she hadn't been misinterpreting innocent mistakes. She suggested that sometimes phones don't display the full frame of an image properly, and perhaps more had been captured around the edges than the man intended. The narrator told her she was being far too generous. They told her to be very careful around this person, and they made a note to pay close attention to any future visit. He came back. He had another photograph. He told Jaime, with apparent sincerity, that he had tried to take it as tastefully as possible, but the rash had spread, and he needed her to see its full extent. What he showed her had nothing tasteful about it. It was an explicit image, barely disguised under the thinnest pretense of a medical question. Jaime, to her enormous credit, did not flinch visibly. She looked at the image for a moment, and then told the man, with calm and measured concern, that she was very worried about what she was seeing. There was a significant risk, she said, of permanent loss of function. This was a matter of real medical urgency. She needed to call the trained pharmacist right away. The man's composure cracked immediately. He started backpedaling, insisting it wasn't serious, telling her not to bother anyone, that he was sure it was fine. Jaime called out clearly and calmly that she had seen evidence of a potentially serious injury and needed the pharmacist's assistance immediately. The narrator came out from behind the pharmacy counter. The man refused to show them the photograph. The narrator asked, reasonably, why he had been comfortable showing a 19-year-old girl but not a trained and experienced medical professional who had, as they pointed out, seen everything in 3 decades of practice. The man stumbled. He had no answer. The narrator half expected him to walk out and never return. Instead, he grabbed a bottle of cough syrup from the nearest shelf and hurled it hard against the counter. It shattered. In the confusion, presumably hoping it would function as some kind of distraction, he ran. What he seemed to have forgotten was that as a registered prescription customer, the pharmacy had his full name, address, and family details on file. The police were contacted. The incident was reported in full. What came out was that the explicit photograph element made harassment charges complicated to pursue on their own. There was room, however implausible, for a claim of accidental exposure in the images. But the act of smashing the cough syrup bottle demonstrated intent. It implied awareness of wrongdoing. It gave them a foothold. His wife found out. Charges were filed. He ended up on the offenders registry. He had spent months using a young woman's inexperience and professional good nature as a vehicle for his own gratification. And in the end, the thing that brought him down was his own panicked exit. Jaime handled it with more dignity and professionalism than most people twice her age would have. The narrator never forgot that. If a story like this one resonates with you, if you've ever been in a situation at work where someone crossed a line and you weren't sure how to handle it, leave a comment. You are not alone, and your story matters. And if you're enjoying the channel, please share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Story 4. The Badge. The person who shared this story had spent close to 20 years as a head of loss prevention at their local supermarket. They had seen plenty in that time. Shoplifters of every variety, colleagues who bent rules, situations that required judgment calls not covered in any training manual. They had, they said, witnessed wrongdoing on both sides of the fence, but none of it had prepared them for Nick. Nick was a fellow loss prevention officer, and for a long time he was considered one of the best they'd ever worked with. He was zealous in a way that most people in that profession aren't. The kind of person who took the job with complete seriousness, who never let anything slip past, who treated every incident as a matter of personal principle. Someone stole a jar of something from a shelf, Nick would be on them. A small item, a minor theft, didn't matter. Nick would march them back to the security office and spend 30 minutes in there with them, and then they would leave, and they would never, ever shoplift again. The narrator had never received a single complaint about Nick, not one, not in all those years. It was only later, with the benefit of terrible hindsight, that the narrator understood the silence. When you frighten people into staying quiet, silence is easy to mistake for a clean record. What the narrator did not know, could not have known, was that Nick had been operating a deeply disturbing scheme. He had been systematically targeting young women who were caught shoplifting, and rather than processing them through the standard procedure, he had been bringing them into the security office and fabricating an elaborate, terrifying lie. He told them he was not just a security guard, he was secret police, he said, and he had a badge, something convincing enough behind the dim light of a small office to make it seem plausible. He told them they weren't simply being accused of theft, they were suspected enemies of the state. He implied, with deliberate menace, that there were people connected to his operation who had the ability to make a person disappear if they didn't cooperate. And cooperation, in Nick's definition, meant something horrifying. It was a matter of pure chance that the narrator discovered this at all. They had managed to lock themselves inside the security supply closet, an accident that remained impossible to fully explain afterward, though the narrator had since come to think of it as something close to fate. And from inside that closet, through the slats of the door, they heard everything. Nick brought a young woman in, 18 or 19, the narrator thought. The girl was distressed within minutes. She was crying and apologizing and pleading, and Nick, calm and methodical, walked her through his story. The badge, the state surveillance, the code combinations hidden in the items she'd been stealing. In this case, bread and tomatoes and beans, which were allegedly a signal used between agents to indicate that a person was carrying concealed explosives. He told her that the only way to prove she wasn't a threat, the only way to make all of this disappear, was to allow him to take photographs of her without her clothing, as evidence, as proof, as cooperation. The narrator could see the girl's face from where they were hidden. She didn't entirely believe him, perhaps, but she believed enough. She believed that doing what he asked was the price of making the danger stop. The narrator, trapped in that closet, watched it happening and felt something in them go very still and then very hot. They had a daughter. They had always had a daughter. And when they finally managed to kick that closet door open, they caught Nick in the act. They told the girl to get dressed. They told her to leave. They told her they would handle this and that she did not need to call anyone because they would make sure Nick answered for what he had done. What followed was not something the narrator was proud of. They made a choice, in a moment of fury and grief, that was not rational and was not lawful and was, by their own admission, exactly the wrong thing to do. They gave Nick a beating. A thorough one. They turned his own method against him in the ugliest possible way, the stripping, the photographs, an eye for an eye committed in rage, and they were not proud of it. They knew they should have reported it. They knew the legal system was the right answer. But they also knew, had seen, in their years in that industry, how difficult it is to achieve justice for crimes like this, particularly when victims are young and frightened and have been deliberately conditioned by their abuser to believe that authorities are not safe. So instead, they made Nick a deal. Nick would stay, Nick would remain in that job, under that narrator's watchful eye, every single day. If he quit, if he found a way out of that scrutiny, if he tried to put any distance between himself and the one person who knew exactly what he was, the narrator would find him. They held everything they had over him like a weight that would never be lifted, and because men like Nick are, at their core, cowards, he believed every word. He stayed. To this day, the narrator still works alongside him. They said they weren't sure it was the right decision. They said they still didn't know, all these years later, whether they'd done the right thing or simply the easier one. But they kept watching. They kept their eyes open, and they made sure Nick understood that the moment his behavior changed, the moment they saw so much as a shadow of what he'd been doing, there would be no second conversation. Some cages, they said, don't have bars, but the person inside them knows they can't leave. Story 5, Doc and the Old Lady. This story begins with a training video. Specifically, it begins with the kind of training video that every retail employee has sat through, the kind that covers the basics at excessive length, tells you things you already know, and occasionally tells you things you don't. The narrator of this story had watched it during their onboarding at a grocery store, and the part that stuck with them, the part they took seriously, even if it chafed against instinct, was the section about shoplifting. Don't engage, don't confront, don't put yourself in danger. Let the item go, call the police, because you never know who you are dealing with, and your life is worth more than whatever is on the shelf in front of them. The narrator knew this with or without the video. They had worked retail long enough to understand the logic, but they also knew that logic and instinct are two very different things, and that in the moment, standing right there, watching someone slide something into their coat pocket, the urge to act was almost physical. A reflex. The desire to be the one who stops it, who steps in, who handles the situation. They had always suppressed that urge. Clocked in, did the work, clocked out. Minimum wage, minimum drama. Then came Doc. Doc was a new hire. His real name was Walter, reportedly, which he had decided did not suit the image he had of himself, and so he had taken to calling himself Doc. He was not a doctor, he held no advanced degrees, but he came in with the energy of someone who had watched the training video and concluded that it did not apply to him. He came back from the onboarding session with a look of determination that made the narrator vaguely nervous. He announced, not going to stand by and let people steal from right under his nose. The narrator and the others on shift offered some gentle counterpoints. The part about 6-foot bikers stealing canned goods, the part about not getting paid enough to risk serious injury. Doc was unmoved. Weeks passed, months. Even Doc was a shelf stalker, same as everyone else. The handful of shoplifting incidents that occurred were handled by the actual security personnel, and Doc was left to watch from a distance, frustrated and restless, waiting for his moment. His moment arrived in the form of an elderly woman. She was small, she moved slowly, with a walking stick. She browsed the shelves with the deliberate patience of someone who had all the time in the world, occasionally placing items in her basket. The sort of things older people tended to buy, canned goods and small portions. She looked, by every visible measure, like someone's grandmother. Doc and the narrator were both watching her when she slipped a small can of sardines into her purse. The narrator immediately recognized the situation for what it was, a moment that required patience, not action. The procedure was clear. You waited for the person to exit the store before approaching, because only then was intent to steal legally established. They tried to explain this to Doc. They tried to remind him of the training. They tried to lay out the very good reasons why the recommended approach was the recommended approach. Doc informed them with complete confidence that they didn't mess with Doc. He walked straight up to the old woman. He told her bluntly that he had seen her take the sardines and that she needed to accompany him to the security office. The old woman looked at him for a moment. A long moment, and then she reached into her purse. The narrator found themselves hoping, desperately, that she would simply produce the sardines, that this would end with mild embarrassment for all involved and a restocked shelf. What she pulled out was a butcher's knife. What she yelled, the narrator did not remember precisely. Something about not going quietly, something directed at law enforcement that did not apply to a shelf stalker in a grocery store. And then, with a force and speed that no one in the vicinity could have anticipated from a woman of her apparent age and frailty, she drove that knife into Doc's chest. Just to the right of his heart, the chaos that followed was immediate and complete. Staff and customers rushing in, pressure applied to the wound, emergency services called. The old woman had already turned and was moving, faster than she should have been able to, faster than anything about her had suggested she was capable of, toward the exit and into the parking lot where she vanished entirely. Nobody spared her a thought in those first minutes. Everyone's attention was on Doc. Doc survived, barely. The blade had nicked his heart, and the margin between what happened and something far worse was razor thin. He recovered eventually, but not without a long road. The old woman was never found. Security footage raised questions about whether she had genuinely been what she appeared, whether the frailty and the shuffling gait had been in some sense a performance. Nobody ever arrived at a satisfying answer. Doc, it was said, had a different relationship with the training video after that. You never know. You simply never ever know. Like this video if you appreciate stories like these, stories about ordinary people in extraordinary moments, and share it with someone who might need to hear them. It means more than you know. Story 6, Hot Dogs and the Human Shield. The narrator of this story was the manager of a gas station, and they want you to understand from the beginning that Black Friday was not, generally speaking, their problem. The gas station world operates by its own quiet rhythms. Hot dogs on the griddle, magazines on the rack, cold drinks in the cooler, a general sense of steady, low-key purpose that has very little to do with discounted electronics or doorbuster deals at the big box stores down the road. The narrator worked that shift alongside a colleague they called Bad Charlie, a nickname Bad Charlie had chosen for himself, delivered always with a cheerful smile, describing what he considered to be simply a fact about the way his brain worked. He was, the narrator was at pains to clarify, a complete sweetheart. Bad Charlie was mopping the floor that evening. The narrator was standing at the roller grill debating whether the hot dogs currently on it had reached the end of their useful life. They had. As the narrator was reaching for a garbage bag to dispose of the aging wieners, an older man appeared at the counter. He had noticed what the narrator was doing. He asked in a casual conversational way whether those hot dogs were being thrown out. They were, the narrator confirmed. The man asked if he might have a few. Sure, said the narrator. Did he want buns as well? The man said that yes, that was generally how a hot dog worked. A bit sassy, the narrator thought, for someone receiving free food. But fine, they directed him to the condiment station and returned to their administrative work on a very old computer. 10 minutes later, Bad Charlie appeared at the narrator's shoulder and tugged their sleeve. There was a problem. There was often some kind of problem with Charlie. A mouse he'd spotted that he was worried might get hurt, or something similarly gentle and well-meaning. But this time the problem was genuine. The condiment station, which Bad Charlie had spent the better part of 30 minutes cleaning before the narrator's arrival, looked like the aftermath of a small explosion. Sauce on the counter, sauce on the wall, sauce apparently distributed across a surface area that should not have been possible using 2 hot dogs and a standard condiment setup. Bad Charlie had worked hard on that station. He was understandably distressed. So was the narrator, given that the hot dogs had been a courtesy extended to this man at no charge. The narrator assumed the man had taken his food and left. He had not. He was, in fact, approaching the counter at that very moment, a hot dog in each hand, with the expression of someone who had been seriously wronged. He described the hot dogs in colorful terms. He made clear that he considered them to be far below acceptable standards. The narrator pointed out that these were hot dogs that had been destined for the trash, that the man had specifically asked for them, and that no transaction had taken place that would entitle him to a refund. The man responded by throwing both hot dogs at the narrator. One of them missed and hit a motivational poster hanging on the back wall, a zombie-themed variant of the classic dangling cat image. The other hit the narrator squarely in the face, depositing a significant quantity of condiments on their cheeks and leaving the wiener itself at their feet. Bad Charlie, who had been watching this unfold, was not amused. He grabbed the man by the shirt and began explaining with considerable intensity that this was not acceptable behavior and that you shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. And then the front door burst open. A woman came in at speed, holding a box containing what appeared to be an expensive MP3 player. She was breathing hard. She was asking, begging really for help. She had purchased the last discounted device at the Black Friday sale at the nearby Target, and there were other customers behind her who had wanted it, and she was genuinely afraid of what they might do if they caught up to her. Could she please wait here until they moved on? Under normal circumstances, the narrator would have said yes without hesitation, but the hot dog man was still present, and sealing him inside the gas station alongside a frightened woman was not something the narrator was willing to do. Bad Charlie, however, had an idea. He took the old man firmly by the arm, walked him to the front door, pushed him outside, and shouted, loudly, into the parking lot in the direction of the oncoming crowd, that this man had stolen the woman's iPod. Could someone please help her? The response was immediate. 5 or 6 people who had apparently been in active pursuit came running from the direction of the target and converged on the hot dog man, who had no choice but to flee as fast as his legs would carry him. Bad Charlie locked the door. The narrator and the woman inside stood and watched through the glass as an angry crowd chased the old man off into the darkness. The woman was deeply grateful. She said she had genuinely feared for her safety, and that they had quite possibly protected her from something serious. The narrator felt a small twinge of guilt about what had happened to the hot dog man. Just a small one. The sauce was still drying on their face after all, but Bad Charlie got to be a hero for a night. And that, the narrator decided, was worth quite a lot. Story 7, Mario. This one is different from the others. There is no resolution here. There is no punchline, no moment of justice, no satisfying closing beat. There is only a woman still searching for an answer she has never been given, and still choosing, every single night, to hope for the gentler of the 2 possibilities that remain. She and her boyfriend Mario had grown up in rough, poor parts of Mexico. They had never had much. But they had saved, and they had planned, and one day they had taken a vacation to Mexico City. Not to the parts of the city most people hear about, the parts that appear in the news for the wrong reasons, but to the safe areas, the prosperous areas, the shopping malls and the fashion stores and the record shops where they could walk around like tourists and pretend, for just a little while, that they belonged to a different kind of life. The night before they visited the mall, their tour guide had taken them somewhere off the beaten path, a shrine out in the desert, a place he said was little known to tourists but familiar to locals. It was dedicated to Santa Muerte, the folk saint of death, whose following had grown enormously across Mexico in recent decades. For many, she represents a practical faith, a recognition that death is universal and inevitable, that it touches everyone equally regardless of wealth or poverty or righteousness, and that there is dignity in honoring it directly rather than looking away. The woman and Mario had gone to the shrine and made their offerings, as the guide suggested, and within 24 hours, everything changed. The mall was everything they had hoped for. Cheap technology and high fashion and racks of vinyl records. They moved through it like people under a spell, trying on things they couldn't afford, holding up the newest phones and setting them back down, pressing their fingers to the glass cases and imagining. They felt, she said, like shiny, happy people, and then Mario needed the bathroom. It was the first separation of the day, the first moment either of them had been out of the other's sight. She wanted to browse the lingerie store, buy something small and secret for him. It seemed like perfect timing. She spent longer than expected. The prices were remarkable, she said, astonishing what certain pieces of fabric could cost. She chose a lacy nightgown, tasteful but lovely, and paid for it, and stepped back out into the mall corridor expecting to see Mario waiting. He was not there. She walked the length of the corridor. She called his name. She circled back. She went to the bathroom, stood outside the men's room and called through the doorway until she was sure no one was listening, and then, with a quick look around to confirm she was unobserved, she pushed the door open and checked every stall, empty, every stall empty, every urinal unoccupied, nothing. An older man walked in as she was leaving and exclaimed in shock. She told him she was the cleaner and she left. She found mall security. They didn't take her seriously at first until she told them, a small, desperate lie, that they had been afraid they were being followed. Then the cameras came out. The footage showed Mario walking toward the bathroom. He was seen entering the corridor. He was never seen leaving. The women's bathroom was checked. The service corridors were checked. There was, it turned out, a window in the men's bathroom positioned in a blind spot that the outdoor cameras did not cover. A window that opened onto a service area. And from that service area, a vehicle could have been waiting. Mario was never seen again. She described in the days that followed, telling detectives about his recent marriage proposal and watching the look that passed between them, the silent, knowing communication of people who had heard variations of this story before and concluded that a man had simply gotten cold feet and left. She could see exactly what they were thinking, and she understood why, but she also understood Mario. She knew who he was. She knew the gentleness in him and the protectiveness and the particular way he had of looking at her. She could not make that man fit the theory those detectives were building in their heads, so she researched. She read every case she could find of people going missing from public places, from malls, from shopping centers, from bathrooms and corridors, and the unremarkable spaces between one moment and the next. She read about the particular pattern of couples being separated, the missing member made to appear as though they had simply walked away. She read about what happens to some of the people who disappear this way, the terrible uses to which human bodies are sometimes put by those who move product across borders. She dreams of Mario walking through that bathroom door. She dreams of someone already there, entering through the window, someone paid to be in exactly that place, at exactly that moment. She dreams of what came after, and she forces herself to stop dreaming before it reaches its conclusion. Maybe he is still somewhere. Maybe he found a way to survive. Maybe Santa Muerte, who received their offerings the night before, looked upon him with mercy. Maybe what she said to the detectives is, against all the weight of her research, simply true. Maybe he got cold feet and left through a window and has been living another life somewhere for all these years. If that were true, she said, she thought she would forgive him. She thought she would forgive him just to know that he was alive. Every night she prays for the simpler explanation, because the other one is too heavy to carry into morning. Take a moment if you would. For the people still waiting, for the ones who never got an answer. If you've been touched by a story like this, leave a word in the comments. Sometimes that's all we can offer each other, the knowledge that someone else heard and that it mattered. Story 8, The Riot. This story was shared by a security guard, and it begins with a confession. They had never worked a Black Friday before, not once. In all their years in security, they had somehow managed to avoid it. And then, for reasons they didn't go into, that streak came to an end, and they found themselves standing behind the front doors of a large chain retailer at the moment the clock reached opening time and the crowd outside surged forward. They had seen the videos, of course. Everyone had seen the videos. The footage of people fighting in aisles, of shopping carts used as battering rams, of grown adults screaming at each other over discounted appliances. You watch those videos and you laugh maybe, or you shake your head, or you say something about society, and then you close the tab and go on with your life. Nothing in those videos, the narrator said, had fully prepared them for standing on the ground inside it. The outdoor security staff had been working hard to manage the crowd before doors even opened. The pressure building behind the glass was visible and physical, a mass of bodies pressing forward, the energy of it something between excitement and aggression, the line between those two states thinner than it should have been. The narrator said they were fairly certain at one point that they could see the glass in the front door beginning to crack under the weight. They convinced themselves they were imagining it. Possibly they were. And then the doors opened. What entered was not, technically speaking, a crowd. It was something more like a wave, a single unified surge of human pressure that moved through the entrance and spread outward in every direction at once, filling the store with noise and heat and urgency. Every variety of person was represented. Grandmothers with sharp elbows and sharper voices, pushing through the sporting goods section. Groups of men who had clearly coordinated their approach, heading for electronics in formation. Women in every stage of determination making straight lines for hair care and small appliances. Families who had lost track of each other immediately and were calling out across the aisles. And then, inevitably, the collisions. Two elderly men got into a confrontation over a bowling ball. It escalated. One of them used the bowling ball as a weapon, swinging it into the other's knee with enough force to cause what appeared to be serious injury. The sound, the narrator said, was one they would not easily forget. In the kitchen aisle, two women were both reaching for the same blender. The last one, the display model, the one that wasn't technically supposed to be sold. One of them grabbed it first, the other grabbed it second. What followed was a struggle that ended with one woman swinging the blender at the other's head. The blender impacted but did not shatter, which was fortunate because if it had, the consequences could have been genuinely catastrophic. The first woman's wrist twisted in the effort. The second woman walked away with the blender. Two separate customers were trampled in different parts of the store. One of them sustained a broken arm. There were no deaths. The narrator said this with an emphasis that made it clear how close it had been and how much the work of the security team had mattered in preventing it. And then there were the two young men who got into a physical altercation over a set of trading cards in the games and toys section. They fought with the unconstrained energy of people who had entirely forgotten where they were, throwing each other into display units and shelving, scattering children's Christmas presents across the floor in every direction. An entire aisle, destroyed, merchandise for children, ruined, in the service of a fight over cardboard collectibles. The police told the security team, in the aftermath, that without their presence the toll would have been significantly worse. The store ended up losing more stock to damage than they had actually sold in the sale. The narrator sat with that for a long time afterward. Began going to therapy, they said, partly for other reasons but partly because of what they had witnessed that day. Partly because of what it had done to the particular corner of themselves that still wanted to believe in the fundamental decency of ordinary people. Those two old men. One of them will likely feel the damage from that bowling ball for the rest of his life. A knee, broken by another person, over a discounted item in a store. The blender could have taken an eye. The scattered Christmas presents belonged to children who had no idea their gifts had been destroyed before they were ever wrapped. And none of it was committed by monsters. None of it was committed by people who would have described themselves as violent or selfish or cruel. It was committed by neighbors, by people who worked at desks and attended parent-teacher evenings and returned their shopping carts to the corral. By perfectly ordinary human beings, compressed by circumstance and the smell of a bargain into something unrecognizable. The narrator wanted to end with a warning, warm and direct. If you ever find yourself planning to go Black Friday shopping in person, and there's no judgment if you do, because some of those prices are genuinely remarkable, please just be careful. Be aware of what the energy around you can become. Don't reach past someone. Don't assume the person beside you is going to behave reasonably. And please, they said, don't fight over the collectibles. I've got dibs on the Charizard. Story 9, The Men in Blue. This final story is quieter than the others. There is no crime committed, no injury sustained, no satisfying resolution. What there is instead is a feeling, a specific bone-level feeling that the narrator carried home from a late-night grocery run and has never been able to fully put down. The grocery store at the end of their block closes at 11. The narrator knew from habit that going after 10 meant discount prices on end-of-day items and virtually no other customers. Just a few other late-night shoppers and the staff working to restock the shelves. Peaceful, quiet, exactly the kind of shopping experience they preferred. That night, something felt off even before they got there. It was a 5-minute walk. Not long, not lonely, not particularly dark, but somewhere in the first minute of it, they became aware of someone behind them. Not close, not threatening, not overtly. A man in a pale blue hoodie and white jogging pants, maintaining a steady distance. Not gaining, not falling back. Just there, the same space behind them no matter what the narrator's pace was. When the narrator slowed, the man found a reason to slow. When they moved, he moved. The narrator walked into the store and made their way down the first aisle. At the far end, they saw a man in a pale blue hoodie and white jogging pants. The narrator's first thought was that the man from outside had somehow gotten in ahead of them, but that wasn't possible. They hadn't passed anyone in the doorway, and the man outside had definitely been behind them the whole way. This was someone else, but dressed identically. The same hoodie, the same shade of blue, the same white pants. The narrator moved down the aisle slowly, watching. The second man seemed to be watching back. Then the front door of the store opened again. The man from outside came in. He walked directly to the narrator's side and stopped. He stood very close, looking at the same section of shelving. picking up items and putting them back, never acknowledging the narrator but never leaving their immediate space either. It felt threatening in the way that only certain things can feel threatening. Not through direct action, not through any single behavior you could point to and describe to someone else, but through an accumulation of smallness that added up to something large. The narrator moved to another aisle. A third man in an identical outfit was standing there, examining cereals with extraordinary patience. 3 of them, the same pale blue hoodie, the same white pants, none of them wearing anything that resembled a uniform. None of them appearing to know each other or acknowledge each other in any way. And all of them, in their different positions, watching the narrator. The narrator was not someone who scared easily. They were not given to paranoia or supernatural explanations. But they said that these men gave off something, a quality, a temperature, an atmosphere, that was wrong in a way they couldn't articulate. The word they used was demonic, and they were the first to say that they didn't mean it literally. But they meant something by it, the way certain people carry a darkness with them that you feel before you can explain it. The man who had been standing closest eventually drifted away to do his own shopping. The narrator moved toward the checkout area. A fourth man in an identical outfit was approaching from the other direction. He passed the second man. The narrator expected some sign of recognition, a nod, a word, any acknowledgement between 2 people who were dressed exactly the same. Instead, one of them apologized to the other for getting in the way. A small, cold apology between strangers. There even seemed to be a trace of dislike in it, as if they had never seen each other before. The narrator hung back. They waited and watched while all 4 men completed their separate individual shopping. 3 of them used the self-checkout. 1 went to the attended kiosk because he had also bought cigarettes and a lottery ticket. They left at different times, without coordination, without farewell. At the kiosk, the checkout attendant was a woman the narrator recognized as a regular staff member, someone who'd rung them up many times before. She glanced around the now quiet store, leaned forward, and asked the narrator, very quietly, if they'd noticed those men just now. The ones dressed identically. The narrator said yes, 4 of them. The woman shook her head. 6, she said. 2 more had come through before the narrator had arrived and already left by the time they walked in. 6 men, the same baby blue hoodie, the same white jogging pants, a grocery store on an ordinary night, the Saturday after Black Friday, at 10 in the evening. 6 strangers who dressed the same and watched the same person and seemed not to know each other at all. The checkout woman said she wasn't normally superstitious. She said they gave her the most unsettling feeling she had experienced in years of working that night shift. She nearly begged the narrator to take a car home rather than walk. The narrator felt in that moment that an Uber around the corner would have been ridiculous, so they walked. They didn't see any of the 6 men on the way home. They have not seen them since. They don't know what it meant. They don't know if it meant anything at all. The checkout woman's only theory was that it was the Saturday after Black Friday. But what would that explain? What does that explain? The narrator still doesn't have an answer, and maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Some things don't resolve. Some things just sit at the edge of understanding and refuse to come closer. 6 men in the same blue hoodie, watching and not watching, knowing each other and not knowing, on a Saturday night. In a grocery store. If you have a theory, if you've ever experienced something that reminded you of this story, something that felt wrong in a way you couldn't explain, please leave it in the comments. Not every story needs a solution to deserve to be heard, but it helps sometimes to know that someone else felt the cold edge of the same strange wind. And that, friends, is where we leave things tonight. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. If any of these stories stayed with you, the ones that made you laugh, the ones that made you angry, the ones that left you quiet, hit that like button and share this video with someone you think would understand it. And make sure you've subscribed and rung that bell because new stories are always coming, and you won't want to miss what's next. Until then, take care of yourselves, trust your instincts, and be kind to each other out there. The world is stranger than any of us bargained for